Welcome, Penelope. It's really a joy for me to have this interview with you today about your work and especially also about your book that you've just written. So, welcome. Um,
Thank
so, this is a wonderful book. By the way, I really like it, so I would like to congratulate you. Must have been a lot of work to get that done.
you. Yes, it
Um,
was.
Yeah, I can imagine. So there are already many, many books about piano playing, about piano technique, about piano practicing. So what made you decide to write your own book? What was so important for you that you felt kind of a need to write your book?
I think there's two main reasons. Firstly, I've been working for 40 years now as a teacher, and I've come up with a lot of quite a lot of knowledge, a lot of experience that I felt it was really time for me to share that with other pianists, with teachers, um, rather than just sharing it on a one-to-one basis with my individual students. So that was an important reason. But also, when I was a young pianist, I had many questions about technique, about sound. I had a very clear vision of how I wanted to play the pieces, but I couldn't always realize that in exactly the way I wanted because I didn't know how to. And I feel there are a lot of excellent books available. Many of them are very inspiring by great pianists, but they don't give the practical step-by-step guidance that I, as a young pianist, felt I needed. So I wanted to create a book that had some really practical exercises that answered all the questions that teachers and pianists have, and also, most importantly, had videos in
Mhm.
so that people could see the movements that I'm talking about, because I think it's very difficult to make sense of the written word solely when you're reading a book.
Mhm.
Because piano playing is about movement which creates sound. And unless you can actually see the movements and hear how they create a particular sound, it's very difficult to be sure that you've understood the wording correctly.
Yeah.
So that was why the videos were a really important intrinsic part of the book.
Yeah, I can imagine because reading all these books that I did, you sometimes think, what the hell is this person meaning here? What should I be doing? And then you think that
Yeah,
you're doing what that person is doing. And I had the experience to speak to one of the people who wrote the book, and then you notice that they meant something completely different. And that's
yeah, it
yeah,
can happen.
yeah,
There's certain really great pianists' books that I just wish they'd explained it more clearly because I'm sure it's something really, really important, but you just don't know what they mean.
yeah.
Oh, and the third reason is because I've been working in injury prevention. I've been working with a lot of pianists on healthy piano playing, and there's a lot more available about this now than there used to be. But
Yeah.
I still feel that a lot of the experience I've got and the knowledge I have is very, very important for pianists to understand. And so I wanted to put out that knowledge there, hopefully to prevent a lot of the injuries that are prevalent at the moment from happening in the future.
Yeah, as you said, you work with the British Association for Performance Arts Medicine together with as a piano advisor, and you run a pianist clinic there with the hand surgeon Mark Phillips. So, what did you learn from that experience?
That's been very valuable for me. I've always felt that when a teacher is has a student who has some real tension problems and particularly pain and a real serious injury, we can't deal with it on our own.
Hmm.
We need to know that we've got an absolutely clear diagnosis from a medical professional. They may also need some therapy from a hand physiotherapist or from an osteopath or someone else. And the great thing about our association here in the UK, the British Association for Performing Arts Medicine, we call it BAPAM for short, it's much easier, is that it brings together professionals, and it also brings in pianists musicians like myself. I'm just the only advisor they have. So it encourages dialogue, and I think this is really, really needed worldwide, greater dialogue, so that medical people who are working with musicians understand a lot more about the problems that pianists in particular face at their instrument, and that we as teachers understand a little bit more about the anatomy and how problems arise physically. So I've learned a lot more about anatomy from working with doctors. I've found it really helpful. I've always had a hunch that maybe this is the problem that a student is facing, but I then take it to Mark and he may say, but there's this thing that I think it is, that I may not even have known about or not have thought about, and then he'll send the pianist for tests, and we'll become a lot clearer, and then it'll help me to know how to work with them more effectively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you do that work, what are the most common causes for injury that you have found? And perhaps even more important, how can you prevent those?
Okay, so obviously there are some injuries that are caused by something nothing to do with piano playing. It might be something they've been doing in the rest of their lives, in their other activities. It might be that they've had a fall, or that they have a physical illness that's caused it, physical disability. So I think that needs to be ascertained first. But if it's a piano-related injury, I think there are several habits that have tended to trigger off or to exacerbate an existing problem. I think one of the first things is how we practice. Often people don't warm up before they practice. They don't have frequent enough breaks. The doctors actually recommend that we should have a 20-minute break. A 10-minute break every 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And whenever I say that to pianists, they gasp, because of course we maybe only, it takes us 20 minutes before we've really warmed up, before we've really got into it. But the way I interpret that is we need to vary our practice. So if we've done some work on some difficult technique, we need it, say, in the left hand, then we need to stop, have a break, do something in the right hand, give the left hand a bit of a rest. We might stop altogether and do some mental work and do a little bit of work on studying the score. We may just have a break and have a cup of coffee, or do some stretches. Or we may go from a faster speed piece into a slower piece, or a very loud piece into something much more quiet. So we're not doing a very challenging technique for an hour or more, because that's the thing that really encourages the muscles to tense up, and it can lead to pain. But there are aspects of technique which I think are very important to learn, which can help to prevent the injury. I think one thing is everybody uses a lot too much effort. So, for instance, when they're playing chords, they press into the keys much too heavily, and continue pressing after they've played the note. So the exercise that I use, which I call the parachute touch, helps to use just only gravity, a controlled use of gravity, to play the notes, which means that we're using absolutely no effort whatsoever. So I think we need to minimize the effort that we're using at the keyboard. I think people are not sufficiently aware of the dangers of stretching for long periods, especially if you've got smaller hands or only average-sized hands. A lot of pieces, a big repertoire, are written for people with very large hands. And a lot of teachers are teaching students with really pretty small hands.
Yes,
I think we've got to guard against not giving them pieces that have a lot of octaves, for instance, until they're ready for that. And we must teach them how to relax the tension between the octaves. So maybe they're reaching out to an octave, but then they're relaxing the hand in between. I'm going to move if anybody's watching this,
yeah.
down so that they can see my hands a little bit more. So we reach out for the octave, but then we let the stretch go.
Yeah.
So we're learning to stretch and tense when we need to, but immediately we've done that, we've released the tension, we've released the stretch. So that's another really important point. And I think the third one is a lot of us have been trained in the traditional system where we're really working our fingers. We think that we're working our fingers independently, but what we're actually doing is dissociating them from the rest of the arm.
Mm-hmm.
So a big element of my approach to technique is that we're using very coordinated movements so that the arm works together. So for instance, if we're doing something 40, we're using the stronger muscles of the upper arm to support the fingers. But a lot of us have been trained to use very rigid finger movement, mm-hmm. and to work very hard at that to strengthen the fingers. But that's often done with a very tense wrist, a very tense elbow. And so actually what it does is it restricts the finger movement. It makes them less independent. Whereas if we actually keep the elbow and the wrist very soft, then we can use very free finger movement. It's very light. It feels strong. But it doesn't tire you out in the same way. And actually the movement is much more independent.
Right. Yeah.
That was rather a long answer to your question there.
But a very good answer, thank you, because I think these are very important issues that I, as a teacher, also encounter very often, and that I really work on with people to get rid of the too much effort, but also to get this coordinated and have the fingers together with the arm instead of separated from it. And it's really, so it's a very useful, and it's also good to know that, you know, from the work that you do with BPAM, that you know that this can actually be harmful as well, so that you have also a way of learning a technique which is more healthy.
And I've done a lot of research over the years. I've studied what other people have said and the anatomy and so on. So I feel there's a lot of strong science behind the way I'm teaching. I'm not just teaching the way I've always been taught, or even the way I've worked out how to play myself. All of the exercises, I've checked them against, you know, anatomical thought. A lot of them have been based on other methods such as yoga or Tai Chi or Feldenkrais or Alexander or something, which I know you're interested in yourself. And then I've just tried them out on myself. I've tried them with hundreds of students before I put them in the book to make sure that I knew that they really worked. And that worked quickly. You know, they weren't something that you had to study for a month or 2 months to do, that you could learn them in one lesson and really put it into practice in pieces and many different types of repertoire. That was the aim for each of the exercises.
Also, you have very suggestive names for all the exercises. So some are parachute. We also already talked about that. But there's a cat, there's pastry dough. What I personally like very much is the name Swat That Fly. So how did you come up with those names? And why is it important to have names like that?
You know, when you're writing a book, it's very easy to find yourself writing it for the critic.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you think, oh, but what happens if somebody who really knows this starts to criticize this or this wording? And so you can end up being rather too serious and rather too academic in your language.
Mhm.
And then people can't read it, and they read a couple of chapters and then give up.
Yeah.
So I was trying to use really, really everyday language,
Mhm.
but obviously with real serious sort of research and thought behind it. And for instance, the parachute touch, it started off life being called something like the fundamental hand wrist basic finger touch, something like that. I can't even remember now what it was called. And I'd teach my students, and of course I'd say, "Do you remember that touch?" They said, "No, no."
No.
Um, but as soon as I called something with a very evocative name, and all these names, they're not stupid. They're trying to give a visual image that will help them to understand the movement better and help them to remember it. And the parachute is all about just floating very, very gradually down onto the keys, just like a parachute. It's a little bit more complex than that, obviously. It's not just that one movement.
Yeah.
But so what that movement does is it helps to coordinate the whole hand because the whole arm is involved in the movement. It teaches us how to start a phrase with a very relaxed hand and wrist. And it teaches us to have more independent finger work. But I just find if I say the word parachute touch, and I say to my students, right, you remember we worked on the parachute touch? And they say, yes. Then now we want to use it in this passage in a slightly different way, or we want to use it for these chords, or we want to develop it further. So it actually means that people can remember things much more easily. The Swat That Fly is all about moving sideways around the keyboard very quickly. So it's about making very fast movements, but very free. So what I found is that all my movements, I'm trying to base them on the sort of natural movements that we would do in our everyday life. Because that's how the body works most naturally. So if, for instance, I'm going to move this a little bit further away and move. So if we're moving along the keyboard, if we do it in a rather, sorry, you can't see. If you do it in a rather rigid way, then everything seizes up, everything tenses up. Whereas if you just, with your students, have a little game, and I sometimes put a little marker on the top of the piano and say, right, that's your fly, and you know how fast a fly moves, and you've got to swat it really quickly. So they have to move really quickly. And then we put that very simple, normal, everyday movement onto the keyboard. And at first, we don't worry if we miss the note.
Yeah.
Because what we're trying to do is aim for a really free movement.
Right.
And then when they've got the confidence that the movement is free, then we start to aim for specific notes, and it's much more refined.
Yeah.
But I find that we've got to free up the movements first. If you think too much about accuracy at first, especially with leaps, what happens is the arm sort of says, "Oh, I think I need to go there," and it gets a bit worried, and it starts to resist the movement instead of just saying, "I'm going to there," and it goes there in one very freely remembered arm movement. So we know that actually that's the note that we're going to. Our arm remembers it, and it gets there quite freely and confidently. Whereas if we worry too much about, are we going to play every single note correctly, sometimes what happens is that we actually play more wrong notes because our arm seizes up, we get more tense, we get mentally more tense. Yeah. Whereas if we encourage our students actually sometimes to learn how to make really fast movements, then but fast and free, then actually they play more accurately. It seems like a paradox, but it actually really works.
I have that experience myself.
Yeah, well, you've studied with Peter Feuchtwanger, and he used a lot of very fast movements around the keyboard, and it was a very similar way, actually. Yes.
Yeah, it was one of his points that he would talk about endlessly and all the time. So it was really very important to him. And it really helped me to get rid of the idea that every note first has to be accurate. Because if you want to play accurate first, you tense up and it's all messed up. And when you just start making free movements, first you miss all the notes. I missed everything, and I thought, oh, this is never going to work. But eventually you don't miss at all. And when I have to demonstrate some of these exercises I used to do with Peter as one of his assistants, I had to demonstrate the exercises. I was always pleasantly surprised that I never missed. You just did it and you let it happen. But the moment that I thought it shouldn't miss, I tense up and then it goes wrong.
Yeah.
That's the way it works. So it's really interesting.
Yeah. So all the exercises I give in the book really start often from a very broad movement. So, for instance, the exercise we were talking about, the parachute, it starts from, we start from right up here and really sink down onto the keys. And because I find that if you start by just trying to teach a tiny movement, people tense up.
Yeah.
They're just effort of trying to sort of control something which is tiny. So what I'm trying to do first is to loosen up the whole arm, get the whole arm so it sort of responds as needed. So if we're moving sideways across the keys, the whole arm is very free, especially the elbow. So you can move it very freely. And so what I do in most of the exercises, I start with quite a broad movement. A lot bigger than we actually need eventually, so that people really feel, oh, this is easy. This feels natural. This is a natural movement that I use to pick up a pencil, or that I've used when I'm, jumping off something or something. And we start with it quite big, and then and quite slow, and then we speed it up, and then of course the movement has to become much smaller until it becomes very small movement. But it's got the essence of the big movement in it. So it's still a very free movement, even though it's tiny.
Yeah, and that's great. Yeah. So the book is called, has a subtitle. It says From Healthy Technique to Natural Artistry. And it's about the balance between good, healthy technique and what you call natural artistry. So what does natural artistry mean to you?
I think most human beings have natural musicianship, natural feel of rhythm, natural sense of sound, a natural love of music, actually. But often the way we've been educated tends to suppress some of that natural enthusiasm and natural ability. And also I do find that some of the ways that pupils practice, the very mechanical, people who are taught to, you've got to do an hour a day of exercises, can really deaden the imagination, deaden the awareness of sound, deaden the spirit of exploring at the piano. I have a chapter which is about playfulness, virtuosity and playfulness. I think I think the spirit of playfulness at the piano is very important, especially for children. One way, certainly in England, aims in their playing, and that's part of the reason why I use some of these fanciful, whimsical titles, because they're also very appealing to children. So a lot of my students are teachers, and they like using the exercises for their children, which they find, the children really like these titles.
Yeah.
But so I think a lot of people are inhibited from really playing a phrase as beautifully as they hear it inside them and feel it, because of the way they're playing. And so I feel we need that technical basis. We need the skills. We need to know how to make the movements in order to create the sounds that we want to create. So I think to free up our natural artistry, we need those skills. And so in the book, I structured it so that we really did all the sort of basic technical work in the first half to two-thirds of the book. So I'm talking about how we use the whole body in our playing. So I'll start with big things like sort of sitting posture and so on, to the every little detail of finger taps and so on. And after that, I talk about how we phrase, how we approach the rhythm, how we think about harmony and listen for it and really appreciate it and bring the harmonic changes across, and all the musical elements. Because I feel until we've worked on the technical things, we don't know then how to put those into practice to achieve a phrase. Mm-hmm. And very often I find people are using a technique which doesn't work for that particular phrase. So then they're having to use willpower to will their fingers to create the shape of the phrase, or to make it sound exactly how they want. Whereas if you teach them, actually, you just want to use that movement, you want to use a downward movement here, an upward movement here, a freer sideways movement, you want to actually, if you change the fingering there, that will help. Suddenly, everything becomes simple, and it naturally expresses the composer's wishes. So we want to create a technique which just automatically gives you the sound that you want. And you only learn that by doing them in exercises that are separate from the music initially, I find. Mm-hmm. So I find it's really useful to teach a student some really simple exercises first, so that they think, this is really easy. Yes, I understand the movement, and it becomes natural to them. And then you can say, now in this piece, you can put this into practice, and it will create exactly the sound you want there, and exactly the feeling that you want. So if you want a dark sound, for instance, for a very sad piece, you can show them how to achieve that. It's a slower approach to the note. It might be sinking down with a little bit more weight, but it's quite slow so that you can get a melancholy sound. And I think that takes us back to your first question, which is why I wrote this book. Because I think we need to know how to do things. Otherwise, we just cannot reach our full artistic potential. Mm-hmm. And I think the earlier we can teach students to do things well, then they avoid all the problems, all the musical problems, all the physical and health problems in the future. So having written this massive book, I thought that I was never ever going to write a book again, but I've already started a new book.
Oh, you're right.
Which is a very, very simplified version, which is for beginners. Mm-hmm. So it's something that teachers can use, and they can give it to their students. So they're very simplified exercises that can really establish a really healthy and musical technique from the beginning. So I'm cutting out all the sort of really mechanical, very repetitive sort of finger exercises. I'm just giving them exercises in movement and in sound, using fun language.
Yeah.
So that the beginners can learn this technique right from the beginning, and avoid lots of problems later on.
Yeah. So and also have from the beginning the kind of technique that allows expression and and be musical at the piano in a way.
Yeah. Because I think everybody can play musically, and they don't need to be taught how to do it. And I think there's a real temptation for some teachers to think, this pianist is really musical. She'll be really good. And this person just isn't musical. I don't think that's the case. I think everyone can be taught to play musically. Obviously, some people have a very natural talent and they just find it by themselves.
Yeah.
They're the easy students to teach, aren't they? But I think the real challenge is to teach the student who seems to be playing unmusically and to stimulate their imagination and give them the skills so that actually they can play that piece really musically too.
Yeah.
I think that's our real challenge as teachers.
Absolutely. Yeah. I also believe that if our intention as teachers is that everyone is musical and that it's perhaps something that's locked up within a person and we have to free up first or
Yeah,
help them to free that up, that's a much more supporting approach to teaching than just saying you are musical, you can do it, and you can't, and we
yeah.
all along or something like that. I couldn't work that way actually. For
Hmm,
me, if I would believe that, it wouldn't work for me. So for me, it's
hmm.
very important to believe what you say in that every person is a musical person, which I strongly do believe. But not with everyone. It's easy to get to that treasure trove that there is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I, as a young teacher, um, I very often knew, I knew exactly how I wanted the student to play. I knew how I wanted it to sound, but I didn't know how to teach that to them.
Mm.
And that's what I really missed as a young teacher. And that's what set me off on this journey, a 40-year journey of
Yeah.
working out how to teach all these different aspects of teaching. So that's another thing I've tried to do in the book, is it's really giving the teacher, so a teacher can use it as a reference book.
Mm.
So if they've got a student who's struggling with a particular aspect of musicianship or of technique, they can just delve inside the book, and it hopefully should give them some really useful ideas of ways to approach it in the next lesson with their student.
Yeah. It struck me that in the beginning of the book you start addressing yourself to the teachers. It's almost in the beginning of the book. So
Yes.
and also how to use the book as a teacher. So I found that also very helpful. That you
Yeah, because I wanted to make the book accessible to most pianists. And particularly to the teachers. I think the problem is you can't write a book that is going to work for real beginners as well as, very experienced professionals. And so I really was working from a sort of intermediate advanced level up to professionals. But what I was trying to do was also through the teacher give the teacher some ideas that they could also use with the beginners.
yeah.
Um, so hopefully it can filter any of my ideas that people like can filter down into the beginners through the teaching of their teacher. That's the idea.
That's the idea. Yeah. So also, what do you think is the most important thing for teachers that they need to do when they want to work with your book?
Um, I think the most important thing is not to try and teach something until you've understood it fully yourself.
Mhm.
I think if we try and teach something that we're not very sure about, it just muddles the student, so it just leaves them confused. So, um, say for instance, a teacher was approaching one of the chapters in the book. I think it would be well worth really studying the chapter, trying the exercises, watching the videos, um, until they feel that actually they can do it really well and really understand it thoroughly and can do it simply and naturally without thinking
Mhm.
before they try and teach it to their students. Because that's what we're aiming for with everything new that we learn, isn't it? For it to become a habit, for it to become natural to us. So we're not having to then think about it self-consciously. And that can take a bit of time. Um, and so I think there's two ways you can use this book. I mean, I know quite a lot of people like yourself who've actually read through it quite quickly. Um, and and some of the things you'll know already, and some things will hopefully be new to you. Um, so I think it's really worth taking time in the way that you read it, so
Mhm.
that you fully absorb all the information, and try the exercises out at the piano, watch the videos, because if you are going to then be passing it on to your students, then you feel you fully understand it.
Yeah.
And what I've tried to do, really mainly for the teachers, because I think teachers need to understand why we do things. Because if they understand why we're doing it, they're much more likely to be convinced that it's going to be worthwhile trying it. So quite often I put a little anatomical explanation or quite a sort of background information about why we do something. Um, an intermediate pianist probably doesn't want to know that and probably doesn't need to do it. But I think the teachers, the more background understanding we have, the better we become as teachers. So I think that is those the sort of why I call them the whys and the hows, but the whys in particular, I've particularly aimed them at teachers so they really understand why a particular exercise will be useful.
Right. That makes completely sense with me. Yeah. I think it's also important if, as a teacher, um, because what you call the whys, if you have them in your system already, it's much easier also when you teach to observe what the student is doing and understanding what's happening within the student
Mm.
without to to um, to teach the exercise more effectively and properly, I think.
Yeah, I think that word observe is really important. I like to move around, so sometimes I'll be sitting on one side, sometimes I'll sit on the other side, sometimes I'll sit quite far away. And that really helps me notice things that I wouldn't notice if I was all sitting in the same place. And I also think that teaching on the internet is quite interesting
Yeah,
because the sound is sometimes really appalling.
yeah,
Um, but you can see what they're doing in the movement. And so sometimes I say to them, the sound isn't great, and it might be Skype that's causing that,
yeah,
but I think it's your movement. And then they change the movement, and the sound really does improve.
yeah.
Um,
I have the same
um,
experience.
so
Yeah,
so even on the internet, you can see the movement, and that can help you notice that actually, oh, they really seized up as they moved that leap, or they came down and they're really pressing into the keys. So often, even though you can't really judge the sound all that accurately, you can still see what they're doing by observing the movement. I find that's really, really helpful.
yeah, yeah. And also, it really helped me. So now also with social distancing, we in the Netherlands now can also teach live again, but then with a lot of distance and taking more distance than I was used to my students actually made me see things that I didn't notice before. So I learned I want to do that more also when this is over and we can go back to normal. That I want to take
Mm.
more space to the student because if I'm sitting further away, I see more and I see different things than when I'm sitting up close.
That's that's a really interesting point. We we are just about allowed to teach face to face, but at the moment I'm not doing it. I've settled quite comfortably with all my students, and most of mine are adults.
Yeah.
Um, so and they actually quite appreciate not having to travel to my house. So I'm really sticking with the online teaching at the moment. But I think that's an interesting point. I think we've all learnt a few extra skills
Absolutely.
um, from the online teaching. I think we need to use clearer use of language, don't we?
Absolutely.
Um,
Yeah.
and actually, that's where I found having written that massive long book and having to think about the language for every single thing that I'm teaching has helped me enormously in my online teaching. I've got the language there, I've got the sentences already read. I've
Yeah.
thought it through already. That's helped me a lot.
Yes. Yeah. That must be true. Absolutely. So, as a kind of a last question, now you finished the book, so you already said that you're started a bit on a new book, but do you also have other challenges for the future that you've planned?
Yeah, so I'm hopefully going to be doing three of the sort of little technique books. One for beginners, one for sort of what we would call grades 2 to 3 in England, and then one for intermediates. So I'm just starting work on that. But the other big task that I'm doing is creating a course for piano teachers on teaching piano technique according to sort of my approach really. And that was originally going to be face to face, and people were going to have to travel to London and come here for weekends and so on. Um, but of course, now I can do it online.
Mhm.
So there's going to be a face to face course, but there's also going to be an actual online course that you can just sign up to and follow at your own pace as and when you want. These are all quite a lot of involve quite a lot of work, so it's going to take a few months. But those are the new things I'm working on
Yeah,
now.
the ideas that you're working with right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. So I want to really thank you for this interview because it was really, really very interesting, and I think it will be very interesting for the people who can watch it on the internet, but also it will be published as an interview in Dutch in our EPTA piano journal. So I hope everyone will enjoy it and go for the book because I think it's very, very, very useful. Thank you.
And it's been a real pleasure for me to talk to you, Paul, and to meet you, because you're obviously a piano teacher who really is interested in a lot of new ideas, and you've got such an enormous amount of experience. Um, and I think there's so many teachers who do fantastic work. And I think the more we as pianists can share the
Mhm.
knowledge that we have and the experiences that we have, I think this is beneficial for all of us as teachers, so we're not feeling so isolated, and also for our students as well.
Yeah, thank you.